Welcome to All About Women, and welcome to this session, this first session of the day, Finding Your Voice. I'm Edwina Throsby, and I'm the Head of Talks and Ideas here at the Sydney Opera House. And I am joined on stage by two women who definitely have voices. Flex Mami is a DJ and a podcaster and a television host and an influencer and a professional haver of opinions, I saw on your website, which I think is fair. Clementine Ford is a writer and has written two books, Fight Like a Girl and Boys Will Be Boys. She is also somebody who is very active in the public sphere in Australia and has a lot of opinions about a lot of things. So I want this session today to be part kind of thematic analysis. I think that there are some really interesting things to talk about, you know, the way that women use their voice publicly, and the history of that, and the way the restrictions and the opportunities around that. I also would like it to be a bit of a how-to session, you know, like there are a lot of people, I think, who, you know, be they young or old, are still figuring out how to make their ideas heard. So it would be good if we could have some time today to actually think about practical ways that we can do this. Because as we know, speaking up in public is not that simple. There are so many reasons why we keep quiet. It is deep in our history. I mean, it wasn't all that long ago that women weren't allowed to express opinions that were in defiance of their husbands. It wasn't much longer before that some women were punished with a scold's bridle, you know, a literal iron mask with something that held tongues down, which was used as a torture device when women got too ahead of themselves or spoke out too loudly. We're acculturated as girls from before we can even talk, that when we talk, it needs to be in a certain way, and that it needs to be respectful, and that good girls keep quiet and don't make a fuss. And we have this reinforced right through our childhoods. We're rewarded for being orderly. You know, our male relatives are allowed to scream and shout, and boys will be boys, but the girls have to sit and play nicely. And this goes into overdrive in our teens, where we actually often find really, really genuine and deep social ramifications for speaking out. By the time we've grown up, it's habit. We all know when to shut up, and we all know when it's safe to talk. And it's a really, really hard habit to break, no matter how mindful you are, no matter how feminist you are, no matter how desperately you want to talk. And in many places, it's actually genuinely dangerous to speak up. The ramifications aren't social, they're legal, or they're, you know, so deeply social that they lead to torture or incarceration. Clementine, in your book, Fight Like a Girl, you wrote, "Nothing hurts more than realising you've been complicit in your own silence, and nothing feels better than unleashing your voice." So, I'd like to start...
That's a good line, isn't it?
Yeah, you can really write.
I'm a bloody good writer.
So, when you were, you know, a young writer that was coming out, what was it that enabled you to unleash the voice in the first place?
It's interesting because I'm so far beyond being scared of having an opinion that someone doesn't like now that it seems quite shocking to me when young women write to me and they say, I just don't know how to speak up, or, you know, I see you and other women doing it and I want to do it too, but I feel scared, because it just feels so far away from me now. But I guess I got my first newspaper column when I was 26 or 27, I think, and I just had just enough of a combination of youthful bravado and
hubris,
and also wanting to go out and, like, I probably did want to be a bit controversial, you know, because it was in Adelaide as well. It was the Sunday Mail, so I was like, oh, I'm going to go in and I'm going to fan some flames. And so I wrote I think the second or third column that I wrote, I remember actually, I used to have this sidebar, and I'd do like my column, and then I would do these 3 things that had, you know, bothered me that week or whatever. And I deliberately put something in there about abortion because I knew then that I would be, you know, I'd have all these emails sent to me from people who were disapproving, because then I was setting it up for the following week's column where I could write a whole piece.
So you just
about
invited
how-
material and
Yeah,
then it all came in. Yeah.
So it is, if people are like, you're being deliberately inflammatory. No, never, me. And so I wrote this piece about, and I still think it's actually a really important piece because certainly at that time, you know, in 2007 in Adelaide, it was still rare to see something like this. And I wrote about how I'd had 2 abortions in the previous 3 years and how I didn't regret them. And, you know, because you always heard the narrative that, it was the most difficult decision of my life and I still think about it every day. And, you know, this sort of self-flagellation that women are forced into whenever we dare to, you know, actually use the reproductive health care that is our right. And so I wrote this piece about how I had, you know, regrets about it, and I felt really proud of myself for making the decision. And of course they published it under Clementine Ford reveals her 2 no guilt, no shame abortions.
Hectic.
And it was just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails and comments. The most, I mean, talk about a baptism of fire. The things that people were saying to me, you know, one of my favourite comments now, I'm amazed that she could get pregnant once, let alone twice, that anyone would have sex with her because she's uglier than a dead dog on the side of the road. And I was like, that's so specific. You have to have respect for an insult that is that specific. And so I kind of like was just besieged by all of the abuse that we know that women receive online. I kind of had in a week. And it might have bothered me had it just been people responding to me talking about, you know,
your feelings.
Whatever. But because I felt so passionately and strongly about this particular political issue, I was able to kind of erect this force field around me where I was like, I know that I'm right, and I know that the reason that you're saying these things is because you're scared of what I'm saying. And it kind of, I guess, in a weird way, fortified me for the years to come. So, you know, go out and write something completely inflammatory and just weather the storm.
Wait for it to happen. Flex, for you it wasn't so much finding your voice as kind of being thrust into having a voice. You know, you were kind of working not necessarily in commentary, but you had like this growing social media following and, you know, were saying stuff. How did that sort of process come about for you? Like, was it like one day you woke up and thought, oh, wow, people are listening to me and I have a responsibility here? Or was it kind of slower than that? How was the process for you?
It was a lot slower. I'd say around like 2014, 2015, there was a lot of conversation about appropriation and being a person of colour, not just like an individual person. And I found that being a person on the internet who was also black, I was awarded this kind of understanding that I would know about black issues and even further of that, issues of all marginalised communities. So I was also finding that people didn't have access to their own fellow black person, so I was that person. Is this good? Is this bad? Should I wear those braids? Can I tan? And I didn't know and also didn't care. And so what happened with that was I would just screen a lot of these messages and then I would Google, like, what was the internet saying? What was BuzzFeed saying? What was, Teen Vogue saying?
What about rating?
Yeah, of course, because I was like, I don't really know. And of course, these conversations about appropriation were from a very American lens as well. So being African and Australian, it didn't really hit my orbit because I didn't know any other black people either that weren't American, that were American. So anyway, so I would Google and just reappropriate what the internet was saying. Like, in this context, it could be bad, but in this context, it could be good, and you might need permission from someone from that community to say it's okay, and it was unrealistic. And then I started to see, on the flip side, people creating narratives about how all black people feel, and I didn't feel that way. And so suddenly I was like, well, should I figure out how I feel and develop nuance? And that was difficult because I wasn't given time. There was this presumption that I should know and that I needed to answer now. And then it was individuals and then publications and then broadcasters, and it was say something and say something and say it quickly because we're all doing the bad thing, and if you don't tell us, then we'll never know how to be better. So there was a lot of pressure, and I was saying earlier to you on the phone, I don't think I would have stepped into that role unless it was forced upon me, because I felt like I had an invisibility shield. Like, I didn't have to say anything because everybody else was saying something, right? Apparently not, because I soon found out if you didn't fill the gaps of that narrative, somebody else would do it for you, and it'd be probably incorrect and lack tact.
Did that happen?
Of course. And I found it even personally, I didn't realise that would happen until it happened with my own personal brand. Like, I wasn't speaking for myself, and so the narrative of, being this like black female musician. Like she writes in all capitals to take up space, and it's like it's not that deep. All capitals, look, or she's hyper aware of what it's like to not be seen, so she wears colour to stand out and make sure the oppressors see that she's coming. And it's like again, like not that deep.
I just like bright blue.
Exactly that. And so I would find that perhaps those narratives weren't necessarily damaging or completely demeaning, but what if it got to a point where they were, and then I couldn't counter-attack it? So,
but it also means that you don't ever get to just be a person. You always are being used by others to be a symbol and to represent something that, to be a political movement in and of yourself, when maybe sometimes you just want to watch TV.
Yeah, exactly. Or want to be chill, or want to be a bit sus or problematic and learn at my own pace. I feel like there's also that idea of, we don't know things we don't know, and so I don't want to be thrust into developing understanding that just isn't there. Like if I don't know the bandwidth of what I don't know if I can't know it. So there was also that.
It's really hard when, and it happens with so many people, and we were just talking backstage about Jamila Jamil and the kind of expectations that people put on her.
She's an actress who is an English actress and TV host who is really prominent online. Most of you probably know, but is really prominent online. And she's extremely physically beautiful and also brown. And she takes stance on things like body positivity. And she's controversial because people are like, what do you know about not having a good body when you are like visibly, amazingly beautiful?
Then she's also a woman of colour, so she's got all of these, all of these other elements that she can answer to that on. What I was going to say was that it's really, really hard when other people put someone on a pedestal, and that person maybe doesn't want to be on a pedestal. Like you might, did I just say pedestal? You might not want to be on a pedestal.
Pedal really hard.
And the reason that you definitely don't want to be on a pedestal. Put up high, is because all it takes is just one person looking for a crack in the pedestal to knock you down. Yeah. And you didn't ask to be there. You didn't ask to be the representative for everybody.
That's it.
And I think it also speaks, in your case, Flex, to the ridiculous paucity of black voices in Australian media landscape. It's like, what are we going to do? If you want a white voice, there are a million people you could call, but you become representative of a community in a way that you didn't seek and don't feel equipped for, really. Yeah.
And again, it's all about lenses and perspective of experience. So I didn't necessarily grow up in an environment where I had other black narratives that were comparable to mine. So I was learning my blackness from American TV and then UK media and then my own culture and then through like an Australian-centric lens and then a European lens and all these perceptions of how I should be, and then internalising things that I thought were inherently good or bad, which again feels bizarre, like you start being uncomfortable with your hair and uncomfortable with the way you speak, uncomfortable with identifying as anything but. And I used to go out of my way to make sure people knew that I was Australian. Like I was born here, like I'm not like black, I'm like super Australian. And even in that, like where does that come from? And who feels comfortable with that?
So what does speaking out actually mean? What are we trying to do when we raise our voice? What's the goal here?
I really relate to what you're saying, what you were saying before about, like, sometimes it's just not that deep. Sometimes not everything that you do is done with the purpose of it being part of a political agenda or wanting to, make a statement. Sometimes you're just putting a post on Instagram, But I guess the things that I've become particularly known for speaking out about tend to be, men's violence against women and sexism and rape culture and lately in the last few years, obviously, toxic masculinity and changing the way that masculinity is conceived of in this country in particular. And so I speak out about things that I think are really important and that we need to keep talking about, and that, we're getting more and more voices addressing those issues. But I suppose, I don't know, it's a difficult question to answer because I don't think that I sit down every day and think, right, what statement am I going to make today?
What's my agenda?
What's my agenda today? It's a body. This is just my life now. Yeah. So That's my field of work. So that's the work that I do.
And I think it's important too, probably, to acknowledge that there are different ways that you can speak out. You know, like there's this sort of idea that finding your voice is about standing up and kind of, you know, shaking your fist and yelling it out. But there are, you know, that's not for everyone, and not everyone has the platforms on which to do that. So, and also, you know, if you wanted to really break it down, that's actually quite a patriarchal way of thinking about engagement with a public sphere, right? Yeah. So there are other ways, I think, of speaking. I don't know, have you found in your work and life, Flex?
I mean, I guess the point is to bridge the gap in understanding. We have so many presumptions about the way the world should work from a very literal lens, and, you know, we all exist in our own personal vacuums, and so it's kind of acknowledging that outside of this vacuum that I dwell in, my brain, my mind, there are other maybe contrasting narratives. I mean, but I also worry that because we're all made to be publishers, where a lot of us aren't carrying the duty of care or the weight of having a public opinion and what that means. I feel like for so long the narrative's been like, just say something, just say anything, just call somebody out, do the work publicly so you're being acknowledged, and then after that work gets done, what's the aftercare for the person you unduly called out without evidence, or that narrative that you hadn't known of and now you've vilified someone publicly, but now you're sorry? Is there a public apology for that? So I see the importance of encouraging people to say something, but there's also should be an extra importance or understanding the responsibility of saying something and understanding nuance and critical thinking, and even knowing that you can only be so objective within your lived experience, and then acknowledging what your blind spots may be. It's always this idea that if you're going to say something, you've got to be true, right and correct, but you just have to acknowledge that you might not know everything. So before, it's like, instead of racing to speak, race to understand, like race to learn, and then say something.
I remember years ago, I was called out on Twitter for having said something that I actually didn't say. Helen Razor had said it. And this woman wrote this, you know, long Tumblr post about how I was like this awful, problematic person because of this interaction that she'd said that I'd had with her. And I went back and I said I knew that it wasn't me. And I went back and I searched and I found that the Twitter conversation that she'd had with Helen, and I sent it to her and I said, look, could you just make a correction, please? Because this wasn't actually me. And when I first said that to her, she was like, I know what happened. And I said, well, look, here's the conversation that you had. Could you please correct it? And she refused to do it. So then I sort of said something publicly about how, you know, this is incorrect. This happened with Helen. And then she switched it to say, oh, well, I just made this one mistake and now you're humiliating me online and how dare you? But the thing is, I mean, that was a pretty messy interaction. Yeah. But I also think that one of the problems when you're working in spaces like this is that there's a lot of hurt and trauma out there, and there's a lot of legitimate trauma that causes people to behave in certain ways because they are operating in a space where they're not listened to and they're not heard. And you provide an easy access point for them to either as someone to yell at or someone to ask to listen to them, and then they might have certain feelings about how quickly you respond or don't respond. And I think that that's kind of part of what fuels some of this anxiety online, is that no one's going to go and yell at some like right-wing liberal man on $450,000 a year about how they feel like the way that he lives his life is perpetuating their oppression.
Right.
Because he's not going to fucking listen to them.
Right.
You know? But someone who is ostensibly on their side will create a space where they can be heard. And I think that that's somehow, like, when you see that people are kind of operating in the same spheres as you, it's easier to throw your anger at them. And I understand the impetus for that. I understand the motivation, but I think that that whole sort of cancel culture rather than call-in culture.
Rehabilitation culture.
Yeah, I mean, there are some people, I think, who... There's no purpose in wanting to change people's minds about issues or about the world if once they prove that they have had their mind changed, that you say, well, it's not fucking good enough. You know, you used to think this 10 years ago, so the fact that you've changed now will never erase that. Because what's the point of doing any of this work if we're actually not going to accept people who come along and allow themselves to be changed by it?
And I think that's a really important thing to think about when we are talking about speaking out, because we're in a really kind of, I think, as sort of social media is now, what, like 15 years old, I guess, 10 years old? I don't know, my maths is terrible, but it's like young in terms of like the publishing industry, right?
Adolescent.
So, yeah. And I think that we're still really coming to terms with what that means in terms of public discourse and in terms of speaking out. And I think that the way that these kind of public disagreements play out are really instructive to that, because you're absolutely right. Those disagreements very rarely happen across this trench which has appeared, right? They tend to be between people who are like, you know, broadly in the same hemisphere. It's like kind of, you know, Australia and New Zealand rather than, you know, Australia and North Korea. I don't know.
Just spitballing.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that this is one of the things that we talk about a lot, is how to be respectful online and how to have respectful discourse. But as kind of online leaders who also have to deal with an epic amount of shit online, how do you sort of navigate those boundaries? And at what time do you kind of just go, oh, there is no room for respectful discourse now because I am done?
I mean, it's tricky because I thought that the response to that would just be setting boundaries, but realistically, you're not interacting with the same people all the time. So any boundary that you would have set a few weeks ago is now moot because you're interacting with a new audience. The only way I found to responsibly provide people with their own autonomy is to have them ask each other. And so I have a podcast with my friend Bobo, and, you know, we were the people who were answering everybody's personal queries. And I have just 10 minutes of your time for this really traumatic story. I hope you don't mind. And then we created a Facebook group and said, please direct all your queries to each other. And what you found is that it took ages to self-regulate, because all this work people were doing was happening, as I said, in a vacuum. They didn't know how to speak to each other. They didn't know how to mediate or anything. And so it became tricky, because I was like, look at this environment. This is all a reflection of how you conduct yourself on the internet. And there is nothing I as an individual can really do on a scale that's going to, I guess, instruct mass consistent change. And so I remind my audience that I'm pulling back because it's not realistic. I don't have the tools or the tact or the emotional bandwidth to know how to navigate each and every problem. And like you said earlier, with someone like Jamila with a huge platform, the problem doesn't get easier. The expectations become more and more damaging. You know, I will never have the acumen to understand how to navigate every situation. And so it's reminding people that I'm not going to. Like, I've got to step back, the whole way back. It's almost counterintuitive to create a platform for discussion and say, but I won't partake. But realistically, what can I do? Because a lot of the interaction with people who don't have profiles on the internet, people who do, is projecting onto you. But I thought you were this way because, you know, you identify as this and you do this and you speak about this, so why aren't you talking about everything else? It's like, I physically can't and fundamentally don't want to. And that's not a good enough answer for most people.
Yeah, and with women in particular as well, there's a really finite period of time in which the public will love them, you know? And once they get to that point where it flips, then all of a sudden, that's when it's all the sort of like internalized misogyny and patriarchal stuff about like, oh, well, she thinks she's so good and I'm just sick of seeing her face. And
gave you the right.
Yeah, and also the more platform someone, again going back to poor Jamila, if you've really used her as an example today, but the bigger her platform becomes, the more boundaries she will have to put up around herself, the less accessible she'll become to people. And then what makes people like someone like that in the first place, i.e. the accessibility, suddenly ceases to exist, and then she's perceived by a public that felt like they could reach out and touch her, that now she thinks she's better than them, even though that's actually not what's going on in situations like that. It's a very rational and reasonable self-preservation. But I just think that the way that the public, whoever it is and for whatever reason, ends up looking for a reason to kind of pull you down, particularly in Australia where tall poppy is such a problem.
I mean, what this, you know, raises is the question of how is speaking out, particularly in public, how is that gendered? You know, like why is it different for women than for men? What do you think?
Patriarchy. I mean, it's for all the reasons we know, and now that we know them, and now we know that we're existing in a society with that framework, will probably never not cease to exist. It's tricky because we perpetuate that in so many ways. Like, I find that I have expectations of, understanding from fellow women, and maybe a misunderstanding from men, and so it's hard for me to kind of point fingers when I see how my biases come into play. And even with the community that I've curated, like, it's just a bunch of women and like 3% men. Like, I am the problem. And the people who are in my space are also the problem. And it's so easy to put up blind spots to that.
When you say you're the problem, what do you actually mean?
Well, I guess that, like, when you existing on the internet and having this profile, there's so much work that I'm not doing because I'm not aware of it. And I don't know how I can increase my understanding of things that I don't know are happening, right? And so it's easy to say that within a room like this, when we're all women, people. When we're all people doing the work, there's work that we must be doing that we don't know of. So I feel like when people put a virtuous umbrella over things like this, it becomes part of the issue, because it leaves very little room for being problematic or learning comfortably or open,
Or making a mistake in public.
That's it. Or even, like I said, I don't want to be the
voice of a generation.
Or the voice either. So even within that, like, you have a responsibility and you don't want to use it. Like, that is inherently problematic, and I'm quite comfortable with that. And that's what I mean by saying I am the problem. Like, within the work that we're doing, I can acknowledge that I'm not doing all that need to be done. Finding a voice is a tricky one. It's a lot of responsibility, and I don't think that it's fair to put that on everyone. Because also in that conversation, like, finding your voice, it's not just for people who have voices like ours, it's all of the voices that contradict our narrative and make us uncomfortable. And then what?
Well, we've been talking a lot about online voices, because that's where you both, exist a lot, and also where I think, public discourse has moved by and large. But, Lindy West, who was supposed to be here today and wasn't able to come, sadly, she quit Twitter because she just got so done with the trolls that she couldn't do that anymore. I mean, is there a point where the internet or where online platforms cease to be useful in these conversations, or is there a way you can bring it back, do you think? I mean, I guess the question is, if you found your voice online, how do you get to control that narrative in a way that is productive and safe for you? And
it's really hard to know what's going to happen, because, as you said, it's 10 years. I mean, in 2010, I think I had a round-edged phone, round-edged iPhone. My friend and I used to call them iPhone round. And I don't know, maybe I had an Instagram account, but it would definitely 10 years ago not have been being used the way that it is now. I think I remember like 7 years ago or something, was it Lady Gaga, the first person to hit 1 million followers on Instagram. And of course now, like, people have like 600 million followers or whatever. So it's either here to stay, or it's a massive wave that's about to crash and people are going to pull back from it. I can't personally see Facebook really lasting all that much longer.
We can only hope.
Well, young people aren't really using Facebook as much as old people. Like, Facebook is a platform for our generation, for boomers and Generation X. And Instagram is, has been massive, but now there's this thing called TikTok. What the fuck is that? TikTok. So I think that
I had the most Generation X response to TikTok, actually, which was to go on Facebook and say, does anybody know about TikTok?
But, all of this new technology and these new platforms will constantly be, being created, and the system itself will reinvent itself. But I wonder whether or not one of the reasons why people are pulling back as well is because it provides you with all of this illusion of connection, but it's not actually real connection. The arguments that you have on Facebook make people feel agitated and distressed, because without that, I wouldn't say things to imagine we were enemies.
Right.
I wouldn't say to you, to your face, what I could feel comfortable saying to you online.
Absolutely.
and certainly the things that people send to us, they wouldn't, I mean, no one's ever come up to me on the street and said the things that they say to me online. So I feel like that, all of that interaction is creating really toxic space for us to even be present in, you know, that sort of low-level hum of anxiety that we must all be experiencing all the time, but that actually stops us from actually doing anything, getting anything productive done. I mean, Flex and I were talking last night about Super Tuesday, and I had seen a very good friend of mine who is a huge Bernie Sanders fan, and we have a lot of disagreements about her take on some things. I'm not saying I don't like Bernie, but she took the stance yesterday on Facebook that Elizabeth Warren, who is terrible, should have dropped out ages ago because at this point she's just stealing votes from Bernie. And I was like, that's a really basic take. And also, Bernie didn't not beat Biden in Super Tuesday because Elizabeth Warren
was in the race.
Her minuscule number of delegates stole them from him. The reason that he didn't win was because all of the young people that love Bernie, who share Bernie stuff online and who, you know, are rah-rah for Bernie online, didn't turn up to vote. And that's the practical reality of it. So that's part of the problem as well, as I think, is that particularly in activism spaces, is that we feel there is a difference between, I don't think that all online activism is just clicktivism, but there is this sense of productivity that happens when we yell at each other online and when we like quickly read the headline of an article and share it into our feed and no one's actually reading the article itself. You know, and if we're at the basic problem where this groundswell of support for a person who wants to radically overhaul like a deeply oppressive capitalist system begins and ends with people yelling online, but doesn't actually translate into them turning up to the voting booths, then all of this sort of all of this conversation that we appear to be having is actually just noise.
Yeah, chatter. So how do we find a way to kind of translate the kinds of conversations that I think, you know, in many cases are important to be having, that are happening currently online? How do we bring it back into a kind of more tangible, in real life, like, how do we get the result? How do we turn the people out? What's the flip there?
I guess it's fundamentally acknowledging if you care or not. I think Sarah and I had a great TED talk on the magic of not giving a bleep, and her theory is like you have a finite amount of bleeps to give, and so if you delude yourself into thinking you have more, then you've in a bleep deficit, and then you can't show up for what you really care about.
That was so PG.
I love that. You know, sometimes I don't know. So I think that's what's happening online, where we've conflated progress with comfort, and so we do what feels good. The click felt good, the share felt good, and suddenly having a difficult conversation with your, like, I don't know, xenophobic boss feels like a little bit hectic.
And actually has to
like share an article later on tonight.
Yeah, but has tangible impacts on your life. I mean, another thing that Flex and I were talking about last night was the way that people can use call-out culture to sort of not only project a political kind of image of themselves,
like a purity.
Also to shield themselves from.
Signaling.
I think it's to shield themselves from from having to kind of engage with whatever privileges they may share with the person who's being called out. You know, so that sort of lateral. I'm not going to say lateral violence, but lateral call-outs. It feels good for me if I'm a white woman operating in a culture where I know that white feminism is being heavily critiqued, as it should be. But I feel a little bit uncomfortable about maybe where I sit within that, and I'm worried that perhaps I'm complicit. My response to that is not going to be, I'm not speaking about me, by the way, hopefully. My response to that is not going to be sitting there in my discomfort and interrogating my own thoughts and my own actions and how I might have an impact on other people. My response is actually going to be pointing the finger at every other person who I think might be like me and creating a shield around myself that way, because by doing that, I can indicate that I'm very critical of that behaviour and therefore I don't embody that behaviour. And I just don't think I'm not saying that people shouldn't be called out, but I just don't think that when that is a practice that is happening more and more, I just don't see where the productivity is, and like if we truly want to change the world that we live in, what purpose does that serve? Particularly if you're not also doing the work of sitting there and thinking like, in my most uncomfortable moments, how can I acknowledge that I'm also complicit in all of these oppressions?
Sure, and I think conversations around exactly that are really inhibited by fear of being called out.
Yeah.
Because there's no infrastructure. Like, if I'm going to come up and say, I too, did X, Y, Z in this environment, there's nobody to hold me and coddle me and walk me through, that confession. It's pointing fingers. I thought you were different. I thought you were better. And so realistically, a lot of us don't have our best case scenario in mind. We want everyone to be better, but we have to acknowledge that being better, you have to acknowledge all the crappy things you did before. Nobody wants to do that. The conversation is counterintuitive because though everybody should find their voice, we aren't all agents for change. Right. And stepping into that role can cause more damage than, the alternative.
And the process of, you're right, the damage is real because the process of finding your voice means that you're going to stumble and say terribly ignorant or harmful things. And I guess it's part of that, as someone who's been called out a lot, fairly as well, and I probably haven't always responded in the best way to some of those call-outs because, look, it hurts. Like, it hurts to be called out. And we all have that initial, every single human has that initial indignation. Defensiveness because we don't want people to not like us. But if we can kind of, again, like going back to that idea of sitting in that discomfort, if we can sit in it and query, what is it that I've done? Why has this behaviour been harmful to people? How can I commit to learning and growing from it and also be okay if people are not okay with that, then that actually does sort of like help to create change, and I think also helps to mitigate some of those mistakes in future. But the fact is that no one finds their voice or is born into this world that we live in having a completely perfect political slate of ideas and understanding. And we've all
that's
benefited.
A shifting thing as well. Like this idea that you can be perfectly politically right is just bullshit, really.
But we've also all benefited. Every single person who calls someone out online or says something like, well, it's not, like a white person who says to another white person who's asked a question about racism, oh, well, it's not my job to educate you, go and use Google. And it's like, well, okay, but it's not your job to educate that white person, but it might be my job to educate that white person based on what I've learned along the way too. That's that sort of collaborative kind of educational process where it's really disingenuous for some people who pretend or want to believe as if somehow all of the like super progressive thoughts that they have now have always
came from the womb. But even framing it as like
I was born like this.
They're just so naturally woke that like.
Which is tricky because even that, like the way we frame it, like it's not my job, and our relationship to work is never really great. So we're presuming there's labour, unduly labour and effort that I shouldn't have to do, and it's the contradiction of wanting to, orbit these spaces as a community, but being so individually minded to a fault where like I would do it, but she's not going to call them out. So like, let me mind my business, which is also fair because again, there's nothing worse than someone stepping up, hoping that somebody else is going to pat them on the back for it.
Yeah.
Like, did you see how terribly racist that cop was? Like, I wasn't going to say anything, but you saw it, right? Or like, wow, people really treat you differently because X, Y, Z. That must be hard. Onwards, it's like who's going to, like, what is that for? So I think it's also acknowledging that if you are going to step up and find your voice, what are you doing it for and what's your best case scenario? Yeah. Do you really give bleeps or not? And I think we haven't made enough room for those who really don't care. And I feel like I would prefer to have 20% of people who cared and were doing the work than 80% of people performing it for, validation.
One of the things that happened just a couple of years ago was that a whole bunch of people at the same time found their voice, and hashtag that Me Too. And that actually, as we saw with the culmination of the Harvey Weinstein trial last week, actually did matter in the real world. That actually did shift something at that moment. But we're also already seeing a backlash. What do you think is kind of next in this sort of space? Do you think that Me Too is an ongoing project? Do you think that the backlash that is already happening around Me Too and the kind of silencing stuff that's been going on is going to prevail? How do you think the next chapter of this whole mass movement of women speaking out is going to play? Small question.
Right, it could go either way. I mean, I feel like part of the disappointment about speaking out is that suddenly your whole identity is rooted in oppression and hardship, and it's hard to look at these people who've spoken out as powerful or brave, and suddenly they also become the receptacle to everybody else's hardship.
Yep.
Like, you've spoken out, and thank goodness, because now I can speak out because of you, and let's continue this back and forth. And suddenly 10,000 people want to speak to me, and then 100,000, and 1 million, and it's all too much. And then suddenly within that conversation, we turn the spotlight away from the perpetrator, and it's like, well, what are we doing this for? So, I don't know.
And it's tricky because Harvey Weinstein, that was an unexpected, I have to say, unexpected, because that's just how bloody cynical we've been.
We've been trained pretty well.
Yeah.
But also, Harvey Weinstein is one person who did incredibly terrible things to hundreds of women. But there are hundreds of thousands of men out there doing terribly bad things to a smaller group of women who will never be pursued or prosecuted for it, and who are perpetrating violence in ways that is less... I use this word deliberately because I think, particularly when we're talking about rape culture and we're trying to make people who don't understand what rape culture actually is, give them some kind of complex understanding of it, that this idea that rape is this incredibly Hollywood version of what people want to imagine it, and then everything else is just sex that she regretted. When actually, the majority of sexual violence that's being perpetrated is very mundane. And when I say that word mundane deliberately, because it is, in people's minds, that's what makes it easy for them to go, well, that's not really assault, because every single...
Yeah, that happens so often.
Yeah, but also, everyone who's been kind of assaulted knows that in most... how to phrase this correctly? The majority of... Certainly the majority of stories that I've heard have been disclosed to me in a way that is very ordinary. It's an ordinary act. And that, I think, is what people really grapple with and really struggle with, because it's easy to look at a monster like Harvey Weinstein and go, he's a monster.
Yeah.
When actually these are not monsters that are perpetrating these crimes. They're ordinary people, and they're ordinary people who have, in most cases, have family members who love them, community members who love them, and they don't want to believe that
they've inflicted that
the person that they love is capable of perpetrating this trauma against another human.
Also,
and they don't want them to go to jail.
Yeah. The political infrastructure around speaking out, there are so many gag laws within Australia where victims who want to speak out about what's happened to them are silenced, and those who share their story can also be prosecuted. So, within this whole idea of sharing and finding your voice, there are so many barriers to entry.
And then you have, one of the most infuriating cases in recent years in Australia was the Luke Lazarus trial. And it's not just that his conviction was overturned on appeal, although that, of course, is mind-blowing, but also the level of support that this privileged, wealthy young man had in the courtroom, and I know Saxon Mullins has been here before at All About Women, and she's just such an incredibly brave young woman, but then she becomes this figurehead as well for a movement that she didn't ask to be. And again, we were talking backstage just before about all of the women that we can list just in Australia whose lives have been ended by violence, whether or not that is a combination of sexual violence or just physical homicide. That to me, one of the greatest indignities that's been forced on those women is not just the trauma and the horror of their deaths, but that forever, when their names are heard in the public consciousness, that's how people remember them.
Yeah.